core of his thesis concerned wilderness, but it was addressed from a interdisciplinary environmental humanities perspective. Þverfagleg umhverfisvísindi. Chris's anchor or basic his starting point, if you will, is philosophy, especially continental philosophy. But Chris is much more than an academic. He is an adventurer. He has done several very adventurous and somewhat dangerous trips in remote areas, wild areas of the world. And the last of this was he was crossing Iceland along a route that, to the best of our knowledge, nobody else has ever tried, and maybe nobody else ever will, depending on. Chris will touch on that a bit more. Chris is also a communicator, using both visual means and verbal to disseminate his knowledge, and he is also writes poetry sometimes. So as you can see, there are many, many Chris Dunns, all wrapped up in the person standing here in front of me. As I say, a new generation of scholars. I have described myself at some point as a hopeful monster, and Chris, you can decide yourself whether that suits you or not. But anyway, Christopher, go to Christopher Dunn.
Thank you, Tori, and thanks for being here. So we're good on streaming and everything?
No, not yet.
Okay.
But just start.
Maybe I should start?
Yeah, I'm recording. You're recording, perfect. Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so then I'll start.
I'm just gonna.
So don't start. Just
Okay.
check.
Now we're.
Okay. Now,
Yeah.
now I can truly start.
Yeah.
Okay.
You're good.
All right. Technology. So, my talk today, comparing Arctic wilderness issues between Alaska and Iceland, and I'm totally going to go off script from what I said I'm going to do. So we're gonna bounce around a bit. So I've been here as a Fulbright scholar for a year, almost like 2 days to a year, and my project title is Applying the Environmental Humanities to Conservation Management and Policy in Iceland. And that was a way of bringing together some disparate knowledges and experiences I have and trying to make a worthwhile project. And I was hosted in Óbyggð by the Stevenson Arctic Institute, and I spent a lot of time there and a lot of time in Reykjavik. I spent a little bit of time in Hub here. And one thing I've noticed is that there's apparently no hot water. That seems to be the main difference between Óbyggð and Hub. No reaction. I don't know, every faucet I've tried so far has only been cold water. Maybe that's just coincidence, I'm not sure. But anyway, I've been thinking about Iceland. And one way that I thought about Iceland was I crossed it by foot from the coast near Skogar all the way to Skagafjörður. And I would like to come back and touch on this a bit because it gave me, part of the reason I did it was for an adventure, but also to get more familiar with Iceland and the Highland, and to get more of a sense of what is it like there, what's going on, who are the people using it, is it wilderness, and if so, what kind of wilderness is it? And so I have some reflections on that I might eventually get to, but before I get there, I was thinking one thing that I investigated was the Central Highland National Park idea, including why it wasn't successful and what are all the moving parts, what was the vision, and this obviously was a 2021 introduced into Parliament and didn't pass, but it's still the stated objective of the current coalition government to create the Central Highland National Park. And this was kind of momentous. Many people celebrated this as very ambitious. This would have been by far the largest national park in Europe. Something like, 33% of Iceland as a whole. A huge, huge area. Very ambitious vision, or so many people say. Frankly, I'm completely unimpressed. I think Icelanders can do much better. So here's my idea. Ísland National Park. Everything is a park except Reykjavik, which is park administration. And yes, please take pictures of it. I would like some. So, this is kind of a joke, obviously, but kind of not, because as I've traveled around a lot in Iceland, you could easily justify protecting the entirety of Iceland as a national park. There's almost nowhere that you can point to that you can clearly say you can't come up with a really good justification to protect in terms of the quality of the landscape and things like that. So this is just to kind of, you know, be a little bit funny, but open up some dialogue. Not everyone obviously sees it this way, and that's part of what I was investigating, like energy development potential and things like that. And of course there are issues here, many, but another serious side of it is that the Central Highland National Park neglects some really important conservation priorities. The main one is biodiversity conservation. And so I have here a couple of maps. One is important birding areas throughout all of Iceland. The known important birding areas are actually probably more than this. And another map where I took an amalgamation of wilderness areas in the Central Highland as compiled by one mapping effort. Not Thorry's, by the way, but we can talk about that. And I mapped it onto key biodiversity areas. And the thing to notice is that they almost entirely don't overlap. Basically, there's no overlap at all. So what you have is you have this premier park grade landscape in the Central Highland, and you have a lot of lowland areas that are more significant for biodiversity, and they don't overlap, and they both are more than worthy of protection. So that's another serious side to this idea of, well, the whole of Iceland can be protected, and then you're really covering your bases as a park. So just to think about sort of this dichotomy in this, maybe it's not a conflict, but it's how do you navigate having so much that is worthy of protection. And so one thing I want to explore a little bit through this talk is thinking about Iceland and the US. So that was one angle that I pursued in this, applying the environmental humanities component. I'm coming from the US. A little bit about me, I've worked for parks in the US, Denali, Olympic, Gates of the Arctic. I've done research projects. I have a couple graduate degrees in philosophy and environmental studies. So most of my knowledge base and experience is coming from the US, and so I keep coming, as I'm examining issues in Iceland, I'm of course looking through that lens constantly. And I think I'm hoping there's something valuable in that, and so that's how I'm going to approach the rest of this. So I'm going to move a little bit beyond just Arctic Alaska as I sort of sold this talk on and wrote you to come here, but I will get to that. And depending on time, I wanted this to be kind of a discussion, but I also have a lot I could talk about. So I want to just play it by ear and see what happens. But obviously the Cameron-Uker Dam was a big changing point in the trajectory of energy landscapes and the fate of the highland and many other things in Iceland. And there were a lot of protests, and it kind of mobilized, at least it seems to me, a pretty short-lived but pretty intense period of resistance to a lot of energy development in Iceland. And so I got to thinking about the US, and there was a controversy a long time ago around Hetchy Valley in Yosemite. This was kind of like the big first energy landscape controversy in the United States, and one of the first in the world. So the Hetchy Valley is a parallel valley to the famous Yosemite Valley, and John Muir was instrumental in the protection of Yosemite Valley, which became essentially one of the world's first national parks. And once it was protected, San Francisco decided they wanted water storage in the Hetchy Valley, and John Muir fought against it. It was one of the last things he did before he died, and some people think it contributed to his death, just the stress of dealing with it and watching the Hetchy Valley become submerged, because ultimately he lost in that struggle. And so you had a dam and reservoir built in a national park, and John Muir was involved. So this is if you don't know, John Muir is a very famous conservationist in the US, kind of a father of the national parks movement there. And so he famously says, Dam Hetchy is well dammed for water tanks, the people's cathedrals and churches, for no holier temple has ever been consecrated by the heart of man. And you have two images of the Hetchy Valley before and after the dam. So there's a lot of resonance for issues in Iceland that have taken place in the US in this context. Now there are even more grandiose plans. There are presently a couple of large dams on the Colorado River. The Colorado River, if you don't know, runs basically, its headwaters are in Wyoming and Colorado, the southwestern of the US. It runs all the way to Mexico. I believe it's the Gulf of California, through Arizona. And there are two really large dams, Lake Mead and, what's the other one called? But it's the Hoover Dam and the Glen Canyon Dam. Lake Powell and Lake Mead. And this is the current state of things, but actually there were plans to dam the entirety of the Colorado River from source to sea. It would have been one nonstop reservoir. And one dam in particular was to be built in Dinosaur National Monument in northwest Colorado. But the Sierra Club, David Brower was the president at the time, very famous, very charismatic president, fought this, but in exchange sacrificed Glen Canyon. And so the Glen Canyon Dam was built. This is a very scenic canyon, so there's a lot of resonance, potentially, with Karunyukur. So what you're seeing on this side is actually a plan to actually dam the Grand Canyon. And in retrospect, this seems completely insane, but these were real plans and this was nearly happened. And so this is a picture of Glen Canyon Dam. There was a photo book and I think a video produced called The Place No One Knew, Glen Canyon on the Colorado. Basically, people that had some photographers went in there and people had spent time over the years, wrote stories about the place before it was submerged. And something exactly the same happened here with the Karunyukur Dam. I don't know the name of the book, but there was a photo book that was published of people going into this area when it was on the slate to be dammed. There are also protests. This one is actually after the fact, but very famously this group, Earth First, unveiled a big plastic sheet that was meant to resemble a crack falling down the dam. This is what kind of put Earth First, this environmental group, on the map. So that's one way that I was sort of thinking of similarities and differences between Iceland and the US, was through these energy landscapes and these controversies over dams. Another was through wilderness and sort of what wilderness is. And you see there's these two maps that show different renditions of wilderness in Iceland, particularly the Central Highland. And they cover different areas. In part, it's pivoting on the meaning or the interpretation of the legislation as to what constitutes a road and whether a road belongs in wilderness. And in Iceland, there's sort of this delineation between a road and a track, but both permit the transportation of motorized vehicles, so ultimately they're both roads in my mind, but there's an interesting difference in opinion and interpretation. So this is one thing that I sort of became aware of in my time through this work. And so I was thinking about US wilderness, and part of what led to the passage of the 1964 Wilderness Act in the US at all was the threat posed by road development and automobiles. This was one of the main motivators in the passage of the Wilderness Act, was to keep out roads and automobiles. So when I get to Iceland and I see that Article 5 of the Nature Conservation Act is being interpreted in such a way that roads and vehicles are permitted, to me, as coming from the US wilderness context, this is an affront. This is ridiculous. These should just be out. This is not compatible with wilderness. That's my thinking. And so I'll just read you these two definitions. And I'm going to flesh this out and say more about it in a minute. But I'm going to read you these two definitions of wilderness, one from Iceland, or pieces of wilderness legislation, one from Iceland and one from the US, just to get things, I have some thoughts about this. So Article 5 of the Nature Conservation Act. Here, area in the wilderness that is normally at least 25 square kilometers in size, or in such a way that you can enjoy solitude in nature without being disturbed by structures or motor vehicle traffic, and as a rule at least 5 kilometers away from structures and other technical traces, such as power lines, power plants, media reservoirs, and built-up roads. Okay, so here's the U.S. Wilderness Act. Except as specifically provided for in this Act, and subject to existing private rights, there shall be no commercial enterprise and no permanent road within any wilderness area designated by this Act, and except as necessary to meet minimum requirements for the administration of the area for the purpose of this act. Blah, blah, blah. There should be no temporary road, no use of motor vehicles, motorized equipment, or motorboats, etc., etc., etc. So you probably are noticing a key difference between these two. Does anybody want to, we'll play the, middle school raise your hand game. Does anybody spot the key difference between these two in relation to roads and motorized vehicles? What's the key difference?
That the built-up roads are allowed in Iceland National Park.
It's just the absence of inclusion of motorized vehicles
In which one?
in the Icelandic one. The inclusion in
The inclusion in the Icelandic one, yeah. Well, through a certain interpretation, yeah. It's not quite what I'm getting at, but this is the game. We're going to bounce the ideas off and see. Well, here's what I'm pulling out of this. So this one says, the Icelandic one says, at least 5 kilometers away from structures and other technical traces, such as power lines, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What this is saying is that there's a distance away from these things. In the Icelandic legislation, it's a distance away. In the US legislation, it's not within. No roads within. It's a difference between within and away from. That's what, and the one thing, and part of the crux of the varying interpretations of this act, which led to these 2 different mapping efforts, really hinges on such as built-up roads. So by one interpretation, that is just an example. Therefore, tracks would also be prohibited here. By another interpretation, this is not just an example, it's specifying specifically what is prohibited to be within distance. So that's another matter. But really it's this within, this prohibition within, and this distance from. That's the thing I wanted to draw attention to. So I got to think about the Central Highland and my position that this is ridiculous, that the Icelandic Nature Conservation Act allows roads and vehicles to be in wilderness. And then I noticed this difference between within and away from, and I started thinking about U.S. wilderness that I knew that was similar to the Central Highland, and one that came to mind was Death Valley. Death Valley is a huge area. It's the largest, one of the largest parks in the lower 48, maybe the largest in the lower 48, I can't remember. And it's the largest wilderness in the lower 48. But it has a lot of roads. And I was like, well, that's really interesting. It's a big desert park, similar to Central Highland, it has roads. It's kind of an extreme environment. It's hot as hell. The hottest recorded temperature, maybe in the U.S. I want to commit to, I don't think the world, maybe the world, was in Fury Furnace, which is this point below sea level. And here's what Death Valley's website says. The wilderness boundary is 50 feet from the center line of most backcountry dirt roads. Only foot or horseback traffic is allowed within the park's wilderness. Death Valley has more miles of roads than any other national park, though over 93% of the park's 3.4+ million acres are protected in roadless wilderness. Nearly 1,000 miles of paved and dirt roads provide ample opportunities for recreation and exploration. So this seems to me on the surface to be a blatant contradiction. It's 93% wilderness, yet it has 1,000 miles of roads, which is, I think it says like more miles of roads than any other national park. That's ludicrous. How can that be? And it pivots on this within and away distinction. Because what you can do in the US is you can just draw a little line around the thing and say, oh, that's not wilderness, everything else is. Isn't that great? You can't do that in Iceland. In Iceland, you gotta be away from it. So you have to have this wider berth. You can still kind of do it, but it's not as neat and clean so that you have a 93% protection of wilderness in the way that you can here. And so this is kind of like this little trick. And so when I started thinking about, well, gosh, it almost is basically like in U.S. wilderness, there are vehicles allowed. And there's a little sliver that runs right through the wilderness, it's basically allowed in the wilderness. So I was like, maybe I just have to think more about this. And another example is Yosemite, going back to that. So this dam, and And this reservoir, well, they did the same thing. They just made a little line around it and they said, okay, that's not in the wilderness, but everything else is. Isn't that great? So I don't know, this seems like a little bit of a cheap hack in certain ways. So it's also great. It's great that we're not going to have roads in all those other areas. So I'm not throwing this under the bus, but I'm also thinking critically about what's going on here. And that's kind of the idea. It's just to think hard about these things. And let's get to Alaska now, and Arctic as promised. Denali does this also. There's a road that runs right through the heart of the wilderness. And Alaska's really an interesting place because, first of all, you think the wilderness, that's the wild place, right? It's wilderness. That's the wild place. Well, it's the opposite, actually. In Denali National Park and Preserve, which is all this, the wilderness is like the tame part. It's the part close to the road, closer. It's when you leave that you really get into the wilderness. That's the truth. And then, if you really, really, really want to get in the wilderness, you just leave the park altogether. Then you're really in the wilderness. And that is true. So, it's kind of ludicrous in a way, but there are reasons for it. It makes sense. But this is like the accessible place, the accessible wilderness, which has its own benefits. I'm not knocking that. It's a great place it's one of the best places in the world to see large wildlife, the big five so-called in Alaska. Doll sheep, moose, caribou, wolves, and grizzly bears. There are other animals too, like black bears and wolverines and stuff too, but those are like the big five. And, okay, so that's that, but it's kind of the same trick. They just made a little sliver around the road. And there's a lot of history that I can't get into as to why it is that way, but there was a really great thesis written in 2004 called Adolph Neary, Denali's Wilderness Conscience at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. And what it points out is that there was this wolf biologist named Adolph Neary that had long been studying wolves. He was actually the first in the world to do comprehensive scientific studies of wolves in the wild. And what he was looking at was whether wolves lead to how wolves interact with prey populations and whether they basically eat all the prey and destroy the prey populations. In this case, mainly caribou. And basically what he found is no, they don't. They prey on the elderly and the sick. And this was instrumental in changing understandings of wolves in the world, which have long been demonized and persecuted and everything else. So that was his. So he had a lot of clout in Denali, and then what happened was, in the post-war period, there was this thing called Mission 66, and the idea of Mission 66 was rightfully to revitalize the parks because a lot of the infrastructure was decaying. The roads, the bathrooms, everything was like either way underdeveloped, like there were no bathrooms, or falling apart because of the wartime period. And so Mission 66 was to revitalize it, but it also had a lot of plans to like massively develop these areas, like visitor centers and restaurants and hotels and big highway type roads everywhere. And so this came for Denali. They wanted to build like a highway style road through Denali and put restaurants and hotels all the way up and down the road. And Adolph Neary was like, this is a terrible idea. And a bunch of trails and stuff like that. He was like, we should keep the road rustic, barely passable, keep it a dirt road, keep all that infrastructure out, and keep the wilderness trailless. And basically, because he had this clout, and he worked really hard, and he connected with the right people, he was successful. And Denali has more or less, it's slowly slipping over time, been kept in that condition that he envisioned, as opposed to the wilderness, the Mission 66 vision. So this is a road, the park road in Denali, and you can see how rustic and remote looking it is because of that. So this also resonates with the Central Highland example, which is it's not just wilderness or not in this binary, roadless or not. There is also something to be said about the condition of the road and the quantity of infrastructure along the road. That also contributes to kind of a wilderness character, a roadside wilderness character, even though ultimately I would say that's an affront to wilderness. It doesn't include roads, but there's still a lot to be learned there and to think about, and that is important. So I want to talk a little bit more about roads and access in the U.S. So there were some protests here around Vilniskard in Vatnajökull about closing this area and some heated protests. And there's a lot of this in the U.S. as well. And just to give you a sense of the kind of uses of, let's say, roadless areas in the US, not wilderness. This is an actual vehicle in the southwest deserts of the US driving up straight up a cliff. And I looked at this over and over and over, and I don't think he is using any wires or anything. It's just literally, anyway. So it's cool, but it's also like kind of disturbing. Like, okay, this is the kind of things happening. And there was an effort to close some roads in Utah, and there was these huge protests when ATVers got all their American flags and drove around, and it's like their God-given right to drive anywhere they want. Is kind of the idea. So there's a lot of analogy there too. And kind of the power and influence of 4x4, the 4x4 and affiliated groups in Iceland. So I'm not going to go through this, but the basic idea is that this justifies my claim about the primacy of roads and mechanized transport in the wilderness movement. And this is more of that. What I kind of did is I kind of amalgamated a few different presentations for this one, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time with this, but I'll just read this first. Quote, roadlessness remains the defining characteristic of modern wilderness. Okay, so that's an important takeaway. Industrial tourism, that's a coin that the writer Edward Abbey coined. Basically, that's commodified nature. And I'm not going to get into all the theory behind this, but I have some philosophical theory that I could get into if you want to talk more about it. But Edward Abbey actually participated in that unveiling of the crack on Dunn Canyon Dam. So he's kind of well known in the Southwest as a writer and activist. Some recent op-eds from the US. Industrial recreation isn't conservation. Industrial recreation deepens its tear across America's wildlands. Specifically, what they have in mind here by industrial recreation is motorized recreation versus industrial tourism. That's a little different. But an author in the Southwest, who was kind of mentored by Ed Abbey, Jim Stiles, wrote this book a few years ago, Brave New West, Morphing Moab at the Speed of Greed. And so I kind of posit to you, are you facing this prospect of a brave new highland, morphing Iceland at the speed of greed? And when I look at this graphic of all the tourist infrastructure, I'm kind of reminded of some parts of Iceland. And I'll just leave it to you to sort of think about and judge that. So let me get to the Arctic. And then I'm going to wrap up and tie this back into the discussion I was just having. And then hopefully there's some room for more interactive discussion soon. So I did a project there where I spent a big part of the summer in an Inupiat village called Anaktuvik Pass, which is completely surrounded by a park which is called Gates of the Arctic National Park. And that park was created in 1980 with the passage of the Alaska Natural Interest Lands Conservation Act, which was basically the largest conservation legislation in US history, maybe in world history, the amount of land that it protected. So this is a longer presentation that I do, but I'm just going to skim through and touch on a few key points. So just a quick geographical orientation. What is the Arctic? Well, that's kind of a contested definition. There is no one definition of the Arctic. By the definition of Arctic Circle, Iceland barely qualifies because of Grímsey, but not for long, because as you probably know, Grímsey is going to lose its connection to the Arctic. But another one is sort of temperature and culture. Anyway, Gates of the Arctic is in far northern Alaska, so by all definitions, it's firmly within the Arctic. And so these are some different maps. This is Alaska. This is Gates of the Arctic National Park. This is the Alaska National Wildlife Refuge, which is pretty famous, and Denali's down here. It's really a subarctic area, but it has high glaciated mountains. So it's a little more extreme in some of its climate. So Gates of the Arctic is huge. It's about the size of, I don't have presenter mode on for some reason, but because it's just doing straight up share screen. But it's about the size of 4 Yellowstone National Parks, or a little under the proposed Central Highland National Park, as it was proposed in 2021. The main difference is that it's completely roadless. There's not a single road in any of this area. There's essentially no infrastructure of any kind. There are a few decaying cabins and a few secret administrative cabins that aren't supposed to be there. I'm not supposed to talk about, but they do exist here and there, but basically entirely without any developments. area the size of Central Highland National Park, more or less. So that's pretty impressive. The one big difference is the village of Upptaka Pass, which is basically completely surrounded by the park towards the north side over here. And there's native, what they call native corporation land sort of enveloped in there too. So I'm not going to get into all the details of the history, but 1980 is the big number. That was the passage of the Alaska Natural Interest Land Conservation Act, which really solidified the park as it is. So around the park there are a bunch of, Upptaka Pass is just one of, I believe, 13 what they call subsistence communities. And what these are is mainly indigenous villages, but there's not a racial requirement or ethnicity requirement for subsistence access. But these are communities that live in the area that, because they are in such remote areas, they depend for their livelihood on hunting and fishing for existence. So subsistence just means the procurement of wild animals and fish and berries and everything else. So these communities can actually have access to the park to hunt and fish. And they have not only that, but they can access it in the winter by snow machine. And the residents of Upptaka Pass have kind of a cutout within the park that they can access not the park itself, but these areas surrounded by the park by all-terrain vehicles. So motorized, like 8-wheel vehicles is what they mainly use. Another thing, well, I guess I'm skipping around, I'll get to. So let me just give you a little bit of history of Arctic Alaska. So there's this period of dreams of what I call dreams of mega developments. One of these mega developments was to build a dam on the Yukon River, which is one of the largest rivers in the United States. To build a dam that would have been basically the size of Gates of the Arctic, as I just described. So huge, huge dam or reservoir. Another idea was to take nuclear warheads and excavate a harbor in northwest Alaska. And this was serious. They weren't like, these weren't just kids like coming up with, wouldn't that be cool? They were serious, and they were studying this, and they were really wanting to do it. So this is kind of the post-war context in which the conservation movement in Alaska grows out of. Another effort was the discovery of, another mega development was the discovery of oil on the Arctic coast. I'm sure you're familiar with Prudhoe Bay. And so, I have to get my years right. That was, so around in the 70s. In 1977, the Trans-Alaska Pipeline was built. But before that, in 1969, was something called the Hickle Highway. So basically, there was a governor of Alaska named Harry Hickle, and the laws were all murky. But he knew there was a lot of money and oil there, so what he did is he just sent a bunch of bulldozers up, just rip a road right through the tundra and said, okay, that's how it's going to be before the law could catch up. Ultimately what happened was he didn't understand anything about Arctic road building. He just scraped away all the layer of soil and just turned it into a big swamp, and so the road was useless. But it went right through this village of Upptaka Pass. And so this really galvanized, like, okay, we need the powers that be in Washington, we need to sort this out. And then so there became a lot of issues with native rights and native land rights and conservation and oil. And this all had to be sort of sorted out. So that's what led to the 1980 passage of the Alaska Natural Interest Lands Conservation Act. So even today there's a big one, which is this Anmore Mine Road, because basically what happened was Ronald Reagan was elected, and this legislation had been in the works, and then once he was elected, the conservationists said, we just need to get this passed however it is, because it's not going to get passed if we wait until he is in office. So they left in some provisions to like mining companies. And one of those was access to this big mining area. And just recently, they've been studying putting a huge road all the way across the south of this, but Biden shut it down. So for now, it's safe. That could change. There's a lot of other ideas. I'm not going to give you all of these. Russia floated an idea of building a tunnel between Siberia and Alaska, an undersea tunnel. Obviously, this was in like 2007 or something. Obviously now it was laughable then really, but now it's like even more laughable, like just politically, this maybe in like 30, 40 years this could happen, who knows, but. There is a deep water port being built in Nome. Okay. I'm going to skip this. The kind of the intersection of oil development with caribou migrations. This is a little bit about subsistence. What is subsistence? I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but subsistence is economic and cultural. That's the main thing I want to highlight. And just different ways that it's economic and cultural. One of the things that these Inupiat, they're called the Inupiat, and they're a caribou-dependent Inuit people. Back in the day, they would have been called caribou Eskimo. They call themselves people of the caribou, not the only one that calls themselves people of the caribou, but one of their handcrafts are these caribou skin masks with, like wolf fur or different kinds of fur. Okay, so here's what I want to get to that's going to wrap everything up. So subsistence use is permitted in the entirety of gates of the Arctic. Snow machine access is permitted in the entirety of gates of the Arctic with good snow cover. Motorboat access is permitted for subsistence access. Subsistence rights apply to all rural residents in subsistence communities, not just native, to ensure survival of physical, economic, and traditional existence. Although Inuka specifically mentions native cultural survival. And there are these things called subsistence resource commissions, which provide local subsistence users an opportunity to inform the management of subsistence resources in gates of the Arctic and the surrounding area. So some of this should sound familiar. That's part of why I'm going back to this. First of all, this snow machine access with good snow cover. Basically, that's the rule in the Central Highland, not just snow machine, but any vehicle, as far as I'm aware, that can be supported properly with good snow cover. Another is that this is the whole thing is a wilderness, by the way. Gates of the Arctic is in its entirety is a wilderness. But interesting, I looked it up on IUCN because I've often thought of it as like one of the premier wildernesses in the U.S. But I looked it up on the IUCN website, which is International Union for Conservation of Nature, and it's listed as 1B, not 1A. And I think part of it is this mechanized access, or it's an error because I find that often there are sort of errors in translation. But the point is that there is mechanized access allowed in this premier wilderness in certain conditions. And so kind of my presuppositions and my knee-jerk reaction to the fact that there are these provisions in the Central Highland which seem anathema to wilderness being allowed in this area that is designated under the Wilderness Act, but of course it's Inuka modified it. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, but I'm going to skip this. What is wilderness? We could talk a lot about this. There's a lot of interesting things to talk about. I just want to get, okay, here's, I think the last kind of main point I want to get to. So Inuka allows what it calls non-conforming, pre-existing, prior to 1980 uses, specifically mentioning snow machines, motorboats, and planes, if traditionally employed, but not mentioning ATVs. So ATVs are out from wilderness. So that's why even in gates of the Arctic wilderness, ATVs are not allowed. But snow machines, airplanes, and motorboats are for subsistence use. And then it raises this question of what is traditional? What's the meaning of traditional in this context? What is adequate? So there's a lot of legalese that has to be dissected. For instance, did people recreate traditionally? Obviously they did. Anyway, there's a lot more to say about this, but so this is just giving different examples of contemporary uses of mechanized access versus like this would be a truly traditional means of hunting a whale by an Inuit. This is probably coming out of Óbyggð, and this is kind of a more modern adaptation. These are the kind of vehicles that are used in this kind of corridor that's surrounded by gates of the Arctic. So I did some project work. I navigated with some people. There's a lot to say here. So roads and access in the Central Highland. I'll just point out a couple quick things before I shut up, and hopefully we can have some discussion. One is I've been living in Óbyggð for a year, and one thing I noticed is that it's kind of noisy a lot of the time. It's noisy in the winter because snow machines are often riding all up on the hills everywhere nearby, in all hours of the night. And I noticed that, especially on weekends, but often just into the late at night, people are kind of revving their engines all around Óbyggð, making a lot of noise. So I was like, this got me, because I was thinking about mechanization and motorization, motorized use, and I was like, it's kind of a free-for-all. And people really love motors and motorized things around here, it seems. So just digging into the culture a little bit and thinking about how does this intersect with how people think of nature and how they should be able to access it. So this is like not scientific, it's just some impressions that I had, just some things to think about, and I'd love to hear your feedback and insights on some of this. The history of exploration in the Highland. There's a lot of things to say. Well, here's one thing that I'm going to end with, which is, based on everything I was just telling you about Iceland, so there's this within and distance away from difference in the legislation that allows the U.S. to do this little crafty hack where they just draw a little line around the thing and say it's not in the wilderness. And the other was this this Alaska legislation that allows certain pre-existing mechanized access for certain people in certain communities. And so I was wondering, is this an interesting and worthwhile solution to consider in the Icelandic case? That there could be a future two-tiered system for motorized access in the Highland. Oh, the other issue that I didn't talk about is the ongoing problematic off-road incursion, which is damaging to the Icelandic Highland. Often this is being done by foreigners. I don't know the stats on this, but through the articles that I've dug through, it seems like it's usually foreigners. And it's not necessarily intentional, it's because often it's hard to follow figure out where the road is. Sometimes it might be intentional, but sometimes it's just ignorance, or just total, like, oh, I thought I was on the road, I couldn't tell, or somebody else had already gone that way, I'm going that way. And my understanding is that, like the 4x4 group, for instance, and Icelanders are very much better, very good about staying on the roads, because they want to protect that access in part, and because they do, I think, generally care about the condition of the Highland. So one kind of a two-tiered system would be limiting foreign access to motorized access to the Highland, and that would partly resolve that issue, while also preserving the access that is held dear by certain Icelanders. Another would be to have a kind of two-tiered system between rural and urban Icelanders. I don't know. I'm just throwing out ideas. I'm not advocating. I mean, I enjoy driving through the Highland roads independently. You know, I have a visa here and everything, but you know, if I come back and visit, I would like to be able to do that possibly. So I'm advocating for something that would be detrimental to me, but I'm just throwing out ideas to consider based on what I've sort of learned through this comparative analysis between Iceland and the U.S. Anyway, there's more to flesh out in relation to that, but that's more or less what I wanted to talk about and throw out some ideas. And if I haven't gone on too long, I'd love to hear your thoughts about some of this.
Thanks, Chris. We will open the floor for questions. If you prefer, eða viljið frekar, þá getið bara sagt þetta á íslensku og ég þá þýði fram og tilbaka. So if I start, I think this is a really interesting perspective that you are offering us today. And I think back to our initial discussions about almost a year ago. I'm really happy to see how your thoughts about this have been deepening, as I fully expected them to do.